Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going back in time to the Middle Ages to explore one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, the Black Death. And it's a story not just of tragedy, but also a story of how this event really reshaped societies and had a lasting impact on the world.
Yeah, it's true. A lot of people have heard of the Black Death, but I think the scale of it is really often overlooked. To really grasp it, imagine this. Between 1347 and 1352, this pandemic swept across Europe and beyond and wiped out a third to potentially even half the population.
Wow, it's hard to even wrap our minds around numbers like that. We're talking about a time with pretty limited medical knowledge. So how did this disease actually spread so rapidly and cause so much devastation?
Well, the culprit behind the Black Death was a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, and it was carried by fleas that lived on rodents, especially black rats. And these rats were basically master stowaways. They hitched rides on ships and caravans that traveled the bustling trade routes of the time.
So these tiny creatures were unknowingly spreading a deadly disease as they traveled the world.
Precisely. The plague likely originated in Central Asia, and then it made its way westward along the Silk Road, eventually reaching Europe through busy port cities. There's even this chilling account of the Mongol siege of Kaffa, which was a city in Crimea, where they actually catapulted infected bodies into the city.
Oh, that's horrific. I can only imagine the terror and desperation that people must have felt. But what exactly were people experiencing? I mean, we know it was called the Black Death. But beyond the name, what were the actual symptoms?
So the plague actually manifested in three terrifying forms: bubonic pneumonic and septicemic. Bubonic was the most common, and that's the one that gives the Black Death its name. So imagine suffering from high fever chills and intense joint pain, only to then find these painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes appearing on your body, and these buboes would turn black, creating this truly horrifying sight.
It sounds absolutely agonizing. And given the lack of medical understanding at the time, it must have just felt like a death sentence.
Sadly, it often was. Bubonic plague had a terrifying mortality rate of 30 to 75%. But the pneumonic and septicemic forms were almost always fatal. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs and caused coughing, difficulty breathing, and even bloody sputum, which meant it could spread through the air. And then septicemic plague was the most deadly, and that meant that the infection had entered the bloodstream.
Wow. It's difficult to fathom living through that level of fears and uncertainty. Were there any treatments available at the time, or were medieval doctors just simply helpless against this disease?
Well, imagine a world without antibiotics or even a basic understanding of bacteria. Medieval doctors, while well-intentioned, were completely unequipped to deal with a pandemic of this scale. Their treatments were often based on the idea of balancing the body's humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And these were completely ineffective against the plague.
So no real treatments and a lack of sanitation? It's almost impossible to imagine how people coped with this level of fear and death all around them. Did they attempt any preventative measures, like quarantines or anything like that?
They did, but with very limited success. Hygiene was poor, and people, understandably terrified, often fled their homes, which ironically just helped to spread the plague further. Enforcing quarantine was really difficult, and the sheer number of deaths just overwhelmed even the most basic attempts at containment. Mass burials became commonplace, and it created this truly apocalyptic atmosphere.
We often think of the Middle Ages as a challenging period. But it seems like the 14th century was particularly brutal even before the Black Death arrived. Were there any other factors that made people especially vulnerable to this pandemic?
You're right to point that out. Europe was already grappling with a series of crises. Livestock diseases were decimating herds, crop failures led to widespread hunger, and the Hundred Years' War, which was this protracted conflict between England and France, was draining resources and creating instability.
So the Black Death wasn't an isolated event. It arrived at a time when people were already struggling to survive.
Exactly. And to add to their woes, the climate was shifting toward a colder period, known as the Little Ice Age, which meant shorter growing seasons, which further exacerbated food shortages and created just hardship for ordinary people.
So it sounds like all of these factors created a perfect storm, making the population incredibly vulnerable when the Black Death struck.
Precisely. These hardships really created a breeding ground for disease, both physically and psychologically. People were weakened, their immune systems were compromised, and their spirits were broken. And when the Black Death hit, it was like an apocalyptic nightmare unfolding before their eyes.
I'm beginning to see how the Black Death wasn't just a health crisis, but a societal crisis as well. It must have had a devastating impact on the very fabric of life.
Absolutely. Mass death on this scale inevitably leads to widespread social upheaval. People questioned authority, both religious and secular, wondering why God would allow such suffering. Others blamed societal ills or targeted marginalized groups as scapegoats.
That's a pattern we see throughout history. When fear takes hold, it can lead to social divisions and unrest. But amidst this chaos, did anything positive emerge? Were there any unexpected consequences that arose from this tragedy?
You know what's fascinating is that even in the darkest of times change, sometimes positive can emerge. The massive death toll created a labor shortage, which meant that those who survived suddenly had more bargaining power.
So the Black Death, in a way, shifted the balance of power between those who labored and those who controlled the land.
You could say that. The system of serfdom, which tied peasants to the land, began to decline. People could demand better wages and working conditions. While it wasn't a sudden revolution, it's a fascinating example of how a crisis can unintentionally spark societal changes.
It almost sounds like a precursor to the labor movements we see in later centuries. Did this newfound power lead to social unrest or uprisings?
It did. While the Black Death didn't single-handedly create these changes, it certainly accelerated existing trends. Major cities like Paris, Florence, and London witnessed significant uprisings as people demanded fairer treatment and a greater share of the resources. It was a chaotic period, but it also marked a shift towards a less rigid social structure.
It's incredible to think that a pandemic which brought so much suffering also planted the seeds for profound societal shifts that would echo for centuries to come.
That's the complex and often paradoxical nature of history. Even in the darkest of times, unintended consequences can shape the future in ways we can't always predict.
We've covered a lot of ground, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface of this topic. There's so much more to unpack about the lasting effects of the Black Death and what it can teach us about the enduring power of pandemics to shape societies.
Yeah, it's true. We've only just begun to, explore the complexities of the Black Death. And while it's easy to focus on the devastation, it's also important to examine the resilience and adaptation that emerged from this really challenging period. Crises often force change. And in this case, those changes, while born from tragedy, did have a silver lining for some.
I'm curious to hear more about that. We talked about the decline of serfdom and the rise of labor movements, but were there other lasting effects that maybe perhaps weren't so immediately apparent?
Absolutely. For instance, the Black Death had a profound and unexpected impact on land ownership. With so many people dying, land became readily available. So think about it. Suddenly, peasants who survived could acquire land, increasing their wealth and independence.
So a tragedy for some opened up opportunities for others. That seems like a rather counterintuitive outcome of a pandemic.
It does, doesn't it? But history is full of these unexpected twists and turns. And it wasn't just land ownership that shifted. The Black Death also had an interesting impact on women's rights.
Now that's something I wouldn't have anticipated. How did the Black Death, a devastating health crisis, end up impacting women's rights?
Well, with so many men dying, women were thrust into these new roles. Widows in particular found themselves managing property and businesses, responsibilities that were traditionally held by men. And this, out of necessity, led to an expansion of property rights for women in some regions.
It's remarkable to think that something as devastating as the Black Death could pave the way for even small advancements in women's rights. Were these changes widespread, or were they limited to certain areas?
While the extent of these changes varied across Europe, there are some notable examples. In parts of England, for instance, widows were allowed to retain their husband's land for a period of time. And in some cases, they were no longer required to give up their inheritance if they remarried, which were significant departures from previous norms.
That's a fascinating glimpse into how societal norms can be challenged and reshaped in the wake of a crisis. It sounds like the Black Death wasn't just a reset button, but it also accelerated changes that were already kind of simmering beneath the surface.
Precisely. The Black Death didn't occur in a vacuum. It was part of this larger historical context. And those pre-existing conditions, the 100 Years' War, climate change, and societal unrest, really played a significant role in shaping the pandemic's impact.
You mentioned the 100 Years' War earlier. Can you expand on how that conflict intertwined with the Black Death to create such a turbulent period?
Well, the 100 Years' War, which was this long and brutal conflict between England and France, had a devastating impact on both countries. Drained resources, weakened economies, and created widespread instability. And this just made populations more vulnerable to the Black Death, as people were already weakened and resources were stretched thin.
So war and disease. That's truly deadly combination. And then there's this added layer of climate change, which you mentioned was also contributing to hardship during this period.
Exactly. The 14th century saw the beginning of a period known as the Little Ice Age, marked by colder temperatures and shorter growing seasons, and this led to crop failures, famine, and increased hardship for ordinary people. All of these factors just created this precarious situation even before the Black Death arrived.
It sounds like Europe was teetering on the edge of a crisis, and the Black Death was the final push that sent everything into chaos.
That's a great way to put it. The Black Death didn't single-handedly cause all of the societal changes we've discussed, but it acted as a catalyst. It amplified existing problems, pushing Europe towards a new era.
It makes you wonder how people processed and made sense of such a chaotic and unsettling period. Did the Black Death influence artistic expression? We often see periods of great upheaval reflected in art and literature.
That's an insightful question, and the answer is a resounding yes. The Black Death had a profound impact on the arts, and it became this recurring theme in paintings, sculptures, and literature.
I'm imagining rather grim imagery. Skeletons, scenes of mass death, a pervasive sense of doom and gloom.
You're not wrong. Many artistic representations of the Black Death really focused on the macabre. The Dance of Death was a particularly popular motif. It depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves, a stark reminder of the plague's indiscriminate nature. It was this chilling, albeit powerful way of expressing the universality of death.
It sounds like a visual representation of the anxieties and uncertainties of the time. But was all the art focused fully on death and despair? Or were there other themes explored?
While the macabre dominated much of the art, there were also these more nuanced expressions of the Black Death's impact. Some artists explored themes of faith and redemption, questioning the role of God in the face of such immense suffering. Others used their art to document the changing social landscape, highlighting the rise of new economic structures and the shifting power dynamics.
It seems like art became a way for people to process the trauma, make sense of the chaos, and perhaps even find like these glimmers of hope amidst the darkness.
Exactly. Art provided an outlet for grief, a platform for questioning, and a means of documenting the profound changes that were sweeping through society.
It's incredible how art can serve as a mirror to society, reflecting both the beauty and the ugliness of the human experience. It allows us to connect with the past on an emotional level, to see the world through the eyes of those who lived through such extraordinary times.
And the Black Death, for all its horrors, also inspired artistic expressions of resilience, compassion, and the enduring human spirit.
It's as if, through art, people were trying to find meaning in the face of the unimaginable.
Precisely. They were seeking to understand their place in the world, to grapple with the fragility of life, and to find a way forward amidst the ruins of the old order.
That search for meaning and understanding is something we can all relate to even centuries later.
Absolutely. It's a testament to our shared humanity, our capacity for both profound suffering and remarkable resilience. And speaking of grappling with the unimaginable, one of the most intriguing aspects of the Black Death is how it forced people to confront their understanding of disease itself. Like before, the plague ideas about illness were very different from what we know today.
That's a great point. I mean, we kind of take germ theory for granted now, but back then people had very different ideas about what caused sickness, right?
Absolutely. Many believed that diseases were divine punishments from God, or the result of an imbalance in the body's humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And treatments were often based on, trying to restore this balance.
So facing a pandemic of this scale, a disease that seemed to strike you discriminately and defy all known remedies, that must have really challenged those deeply held beliefs.
It did, and while progress was slow, the Black Death really forced people to confront the limitations of their existing medical knowledge. It exposed the ineffectiveness of traditional treatments and prompted some to question, the prevailing theories and seek new explanations.
It must have been a humbling experience for the healers at the time, realizing that they had no real answers to this devastating plague. Did any new ideas emerge?
Well, one idea that gained traction was the miasma theory. And this theory held that bad air, or miasma, was the cause of illness. People observed that the plague seemed to spread more rapidly in crowded, unsanitary conditions, which lent some credence to this idea.
That's fascinating. So while not entirely accurate, this miasma theory was a step towards recognizing the role of environmental factors in the spread of disease. Would you say that the Black Death, in a way, planted the seeds for a more scientific approach to understanding illness?
It's certainly possible. While it took centuries for germ theory to emerge and be widely accepted, the Black Death pushed people to think more critically about the causes of illness, to move beyond supernatural explanations and consider the role of the environment and other tangible factors.
It's a powerful example of how, even in the darkest of times, human curiosity and the desire for knowledge can drive progress. But amidst the suffering and the societal upheaval, some historians argue that the Black Death also had some surprising long-term positive consequences.
That's right. It's important to acknowledge the full spectrum of the Black Death's impact, both the devastating losses and the unexpected outcomes. Some historians argue that the significant population reduction ultimately led to increased prosperity for those who survived.
That's a little hard to grasp, given the scale of the tragedy. How could a pandemic that wiped out millions lead to positive economic outcome?
Well, think about it this way. With fewer people competing for land, jobs, and resources, those who survived often found themselves in a better economic position. Wages rose as the demand for labor increased. There was more land to go around, and opportunities for advancement that wouldn't have been possible before the plague.
So in a way, the Black Death, while a horrific event, shook up the existing social and economic order, creating opportunities for upward mobility that wouldn't have existed otherwise.
Exactly. It's a reminder that history is rarely simple or straightforward. It's crucial to acknowledge the immense suffering that came with these changes. But it's also important to recognize that even the most catastrophic events can have unintended consequences, some of which can be positive.
It's a complex legacy, to say the least. It's challenging to reconcile the horrors of the Black Death with the idea that it may have also brought about some positive changes.
It is. The Black Death reminds us that history is full of nuance, contradiction, and unintended consequences. It was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, but it also forced societies to adapt, innovate, and ultimately transform. It's a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of our world and the enduring power of pandemics to shape the course of history.
Well, this has been quite a journey. The Black Death is so much more than just a historical event. It's a story about human resilience, the power of change, and the enduring impact of pandemics.
It certainly is. And while the Black Death may be a distant chapter in our past, its echoes can still be felt today. Understanding its complexities can provide valuable insights as we navigate the challenges of our own time. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, humanity has an incredible capacity for adaptation, innovation, and ultimately progress.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive. And for our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning from the lessons of history. After all, as we've seen today, even the darkest chapters can offer valuable insights that can help illuminate our present and guide our future.